It was the kind of night where the trees seemed to whisper to each other, their branches swaying gently in the cold midnight breeze. The wind had a voice of its own, carrying with it the unmistakable feeling of unease that gripped Cedar Bluff. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the town. The streets, usually quiet, seemed emptier tonight. The eerie silence that blanketed the area felt almost unnatural, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. In this small, sleepy town, nestled deep within the dense woods of northern America, the night felt different. There was something about the air that was heavier than usual, something that the locals had come to understand over the years, a feeling that couldn't be explained away, no matter how hard they tried. Cedar Bluff wasn't like most towns. Its beauty was undeniable, with towering trees and winding rivers that seemed to breathe life into the landscape. But beneath the serene surface of its rural charm, there were whispers. Whispers that carried on the wind and echoed through the woods. Whispers about the past. Whispers about the things that had happened here, long before anyone had arrived to call it home. The town, with all its small-town warmth, hid a secret so dark that it had become little more than a myth. A legend passed from one generation to the next. It was a story that the elders told with shaking hands, their voices dropping to a low whisper, almost as if they feared the very telling of it would bring its curse back to life. The legend of Black Hollow. It wasn't just another campfire story. It wasn't the type of tale designed to spook children before bed. No, this was a story of real terror, of a place deep within the woods, a place where nothing could be trusted, and no one ever returned the same. People in Cedar Bluff knew better than to speak too loudly about it, especially after dark. It was a story that had been passed down for generations, one that had been quietly hidden behind the veil of superstition. The old-timers in town would tell you to avoid the woods at all costs, to never venture too close to the forest's edge when the sun dipped below the horizon. But despite the warnings, despite the fear that clung to the very air in Cedar Bluff, the legend of Black Hollow lived on, and every now and then, someone would forget the warnings, someone would forget the past, and they would wander into the woods to discover the truth for themselves. For years, the people of Cedar Bluff spoke in hushed tones about the strange noises that came from the forest at night. A faint rustling, the creaking of trees swaying in the wind, the unsettling sound of something moving just beyond the reach of the eyes. But that wasn't all. There were other sounds too. Sounds that couldn't be explained away by the usual creaks and groans of the woods. low murmurs, faint whispers that seemed to travel with the wind, but never with a clear direction. People would hear them in the dead of night, in the darkest hours, when the world around them seemed to hold its breath. They would hear the whispers echoing through their homes, creeping in through the cracks in the windows, slipping under the doors. And those who heard them. It was said that every night at midnight, the hollow deep in the forest would awaken. But the awakening wasn't a gentle stir. It wasn't the soft rustling of leaves or the light brush of wind against the trees. No, the awakening of Black Hollow was a violent thing. The earth seemed to shift, the trees groaning as if they too were disturbed by whatever stirred within the hollow's depths. Some claimed that the spirits of the past were the ones that stirred, rising from their graves to walk the earth once more. They said the spirits of those who had come before, the ones who had died in the hollow under strange and mysterious circumstances, were trapped in the woods, their souls bound to the land by an ancient curse. Others whispered that it wasn't the spirits of the dead at all, but something much darker that lived within the forest. A malevolent presence that lurked in the shadows, feeding off the fear of anyone foolish enough to trespass. The town's elders didn't speak of it much anymore, but in their eyes, there was always a trace of something. Fear, regret, perhaps even a little guilt. They knew in the deepest parts of their hearts that the curse of Black Hollow had never truly gone away. It had simply been waiting, biding its time, watching the new generation grow up without the knowledge of the horrors that had come before them. They saw the curious glint in the eyes of the young people in town, the ones who didn't fully understand the danger, and they prayed that they would heed the warnings before it was too late. But, as every good storyteller knows, there's always someone who can't resist the call. There's always someone who has to know for themselves, to test the waters, to see if the stories are really true. And in Cedar Bluff, it was no different. Time and time again, someone would wander too far into the woods, drawn by the lure of the unknown, and time again, they would vanish, lost to the darkness of Black Hollow. Some of them returned, but they were never the same. The fear in their eyes spoke volumes. They had seen something that had changed them forever, and they wouldn't or couldn't speak of it. Those who never returned were the ones who became part of the legend themselves, their names whispered alongside the stories of the cursed woods. No one knew exactly what happened in Black Hollow. No one could say for sure what kind of dark force had taken hold of the land. The locals, those who had lived in Cedar Bluff all their lives, simply knew that there were places in this world where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. Places where the past and the present collided in ways that no one could understand. And Black Hollow was one of those places. To the outsider, Cedar Bluff may have looked like a typical small town, a place where families lived simple lives and kids played in the streets. But to the people who truly understood the history of the land, Cedar Bluff was anything but ordinary. The woods that surrounded the town were alive with stories, each tree holding a secret, each rustling leaf whispering a warning. And in the heart of those woods, buried deep in the forgotten corners of Black Hollow, the past still lingered, waiting. The legend of Black Hollow wasn't just a story, it was a warning. And in Cedar Bluff, it was a warning that everyone heard, but no one truly wanted to believe. Until one night, someone would venture too far. It was a chilly autumn evening when a group of friends, Jake, Sarah, Emily, and Ben, decided to venture into the woods. The night had fallen early, wrapping the town of Cedar Bluff in a blanket of deep shadows and cold air. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves on the trees and carrying with it the smell of damp earth. The type of air that made you pull your jacket tighter around you. It wasn't unusual for the temperature to drop this time of year. But tonight, the chill felt different. It was as if something unseen was moving through the woods, stirring the branches, whispering secrets to the night. For weeks now, the group had talked about the legend of Black Hollow, the strange stories that surrounded the old woods at the edge of town. It had become something of a dare, something to talk about over beers or around campfires. Jake, the adventurous one of the group, had been pushing for this night for weeks. He was the one who couldn't let go of the idea of venturing into the heart of the forest to see if the stories were true. It wasn't that he believed in the curse or the spirits of the forest, but he liked a good challenge. It was all about proving the legend wrong, proving that it was just a collection of old, exaggerated stories meant to scare the locals. Sarah, on the other hand, was always the skeptic. She laughed off the ghost stories, rolling her eyes every time someone brought up Black Hollow. "It's just an old story," she'd say, shaking her head. Something to keep people from wandering too far into the woods. People just like to make up things when they're scared. But even as she spoke those words, there was a small voice in the back of her head. A voice that told her that maybe, just maybe, there was something to these stories. But she pushed that thought away, dismissing it as nonsense. She wasn't the type to be swayed by tales spun in the dark corners of a bar or whispered around a campfire. Emily and Ben were somewhere in between. Emily, always more sensitive to the atmosphere around her, had heard the stories. And while she didn't fully believe them, she wasn't so quick to dismiss them either. She'd heard too many strange things in the woods over the years. Creaking branches, rustling leaves in places where no animals seemed to go. Things that didn't make sense. Ben, like Jake, was more intrigued by the mystery. He wasn't afraid of ghosts, but the idea of an ancient curse was something that excited him in a strange way. He liked history, liked unraveling old stories and seeing if there was any truth behind them. Tonight, he wasn't just going to sit back and listen to the whispers. He was going to go into the woods and see for himself what lay hidden in the shadows. The four of them had been sitting in Jake's truck just outside the town, their breath visible in the cold air as they gathered their gear. Flashlights, jackets, and a couple of thermoses of hot coffee to keep them going. They talked about what they'd heard, the strange disappearances over the years, the way people would go into the woods and never come back. Or if they did, they were never quite the same. They talked about the whispers that seemed to follow people, the eyes that some claimed to feel on them, watching them from the trees. Sarah was skeptical, but even she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that settled in her stomach as they talked. She tried to laugh it off, but her laugh didn't quite reach her eyes. As midnight drew closer, the forest loomed before them, its dark, twisted branches reaching up like skeletal hands against the sky. The air felt thick, almost electric, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. They could hear the wind howling in the distance, and the rustling of the leaves sounded almost like soft footsteps in the darkness. The forest, which seemed so peaceful in the daytime, now looked menacing. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, stretching farther, as if they were hiding something. Ben was the first to step out of the truck, followed closely by Jake. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, his breath puffing out in the cold night air. "This is it," Ben said, his voice almost a whisper. His words seemed to get lost in the wind, swallowed by the forest before they could reach the others. Sarah hesitated. She looked out at the woods, the feeling of unease in her stomach growing. "You know, we don't have to do this. We can turn around. I'm fine with just hearing the story." Jake, ever the adventurous one, shot her a grin. "Too late for that now, Sarah. We're already here. Besides, you've been saying it's all just a story, so prove it to us." He raised his flashlight and waved it around, like a beacon, almost daring the forest to prove him wrong. Emily, staying close to Sarah, looked at the dark woods with caution. "I don't know, guys. It doesn't feel right. I've been hearing weird stuff about this place for years." "Come on, Em," Ben urged, his voice low and convincing. "You don't believe in any of that ghost stuff, do you? We're just going for a walk. Nothing's going to happen." But even as he said it, the wind seemed to pick up, pushing them further into the forest. It felt like the trees themselves were alive, guiding them deeper into the hollow. The light from their flashlights danced across the ground, catching on the gnarled roots that twisted up from the earth like fingers trying to grasp at their ankles. The woods around them were still, too still, almost. The usual sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls were absent, replaced by an eerie quiet that made the air feel thick, heavy, as if it had been soaked with centuries of forgotten secrets. As they stepped further in, the feeling of being watched began to creep over them. It was subtle at first, like the slight brushing of a cold breeze against the back of their necks. But it grew stronger with every step they took. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing tighter together, their branches interlacing overhead to form a dark canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The path before them had become more difficult to navigate. They had to push through thick bushes, and the ground was uneven, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. Their footsteps seemed louder in the silence, echoing through the trees, as if their presence had disturbed something that had been dormant for far too long. And then it happened. A sound, a faint, almost imperceptible rustling behind them. At first, they thought it was the wind, but it didn't feel like wind. It felt like something was moving. Something was there, just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Sarah froze. She looked over at Emily, her face pale in the beam of her flashlight. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Emily nodded, her face taut with fear. "Yeah, I heard it too." It wasn't the wind. Jake and Ben turned back toward the sound, their flashlights scanning the trees. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the darkness stretching out endlessly before them. And yet, they both felt it. A presence. Something was watching them, and it wasn't human. It was then that they realized the woods weren't just dark. They were alive. The whispers of Black Hollow were real. The curse, the stories, they weren't just legends. They were warnings. And they had come too far to turn back. The air grew heavy as they stepped deeper into Black Hollow. The trees surrounding them were unnaturally thick, their branches twisting and interlocking like gnarled fingers, reaching out from the ground, desperate to pull them deeper into the forest. The further they went, the darker it became, as if the woods themselves were closing in around them. The path, which had once been visible, now seemed to disappear into an abyss of shadows. The beam of their flashlights cut through the darkness, but only revealed more trees, their bark slick with moisture and the dampness of the night air. It felt as though they had entered another world, one where time didn't exist and everything around them was caught in an eternal night. Jake, Ben, Sarah, and Emily walked in a loose formation, trying to maintain their courage. But the unease that had started when they first entered the woods was beginning to consume them. They tried to laugh it off, tell themselves it was all just their imaginations running wild. But the feeling that they were being watched was inescapable. Every step they took felt heavier, as though the ground beneath them was more than just dirt. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting for their trespass. "I don't like this," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible in the thick silence that had descended upon them. Her hands gripped her flashlight tightly, as though it was the only thing separating her from whatever was lurking in the dark. Her breath was shallow, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just beyond her line of sight. It wasn't just the stillness of the woods. It was the presence. There was something there, watching them, waiting. Ben, ever the fearless one, let out a soft laugh, though it was hollow and unconvincing. He turned to look at Emily, trying to offer a reassuring smile. "Come on, it's just the wind. There's nothing to be afraid of. We're in the woods, Emily. It's normal for it to feel creepy, but there's nothing here. No ghosts, no monsters, just trees." And a sudden gust of wind interrupted him. But it wasn't the wind they were used to. This wind was cold, biting, and seemed to cut right through their clothes. It didn't carry the usual sounds of the forest with it. No rustling leaves or the faint howl of distant animals. Instead, it was silent, save for the soft, eerie whispers that seemed to follow the breeze, drifting just beyond the edge of hearing. At that moment, a chill crept down their spines, and the air around them seemed to freeze. The temperature dropped so suddenly that it felt like they had just walked into a cold storage room. Their breath appeared in front of them in misty clouds, and their hands began to tremble from the unexpected cold. I don't like this," Sarah said, her voice shaking as she pulled her jacket tighter around her. "We should go back," but Ben shook his head, his face set in determination. "We're not turning back now," he said, his voice firm, but with an edge of uncertainty. "We came here for a reason, remember? We need to at least see what's really out here. I'm not going to let some old stories scare me away." Jake, walking ahead with a slight grin on his face, felt his confidence start to slip. He was the one who had pushed for this, who had insisted they walk into Black Hollow to prove there was nothing to fear. But as they pressed forward into the deeper woods, even he couldn't ignore the rising sense of dread that seemed to settle over them like a thick fog. Branches above them creaked in the wind, their skeletal shapes forming shadows that twisted and moved with the breeze. There was no longer any sound of animals, no chirping of crickets or rustling of leaves in the underbrush. The forest had become disturbingly silent, and the only noise was the whispering wind. The whispers were the worst part. It was as if they weren't coming from the wind at all, but from something else. Something that couldn't be seen, but could be felt. The words were just out of reach, like a distant conversation that you couldn't quite catch. And yet, it felt personal. It felt like the forest was speaking directly to them. Ben paused, his flashlight flickering as if it were reacting to the strange atmosphere. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice suddenly more cautious. The others stopped, their eyes scanning the darkness around them. The soft murmurs continued, a steady stream of whispers that seemed to follow them wherever they moved. But it wasn't the wind. It couldn't be. The wind didn't speak, didn't have a voice, didn't call out to them like this. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest. "It's nothing. It's just the wind, okay? We've been walking too long. Let's go back, now." But Emily, who had been walking silently at the back of the group, suddenly stopped. Her eyes widened as she turned to look into the dark woods behind them. There was something in her gaze that made Jake's stomach turn. It was as though she had seen something that made her believe in the impossible. Emily's voice caught in her throat. She turned her flashlight to the darkness, trying to pierce the blackness that lay just beyond the reach of the beam. But all she could see were trees. Tall, thick trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. And yet, something wasn't right. There was movement, shapes shifting just beyond her sight. Figures, perhaps, but they were gone before she could be sure. "I think something's out there," Emily whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Jake's heart skipped a beat, and a cold sweat broke out on his skin. He turned, his flashlight shaking, as he scanned the forest. But he saw nothing. Nothing but the oppressive darkness. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though the words felt hollow. "I don't think so," Emily said, her voice trembling now. "It's watching us." The others froze. The wind seemed to die down for a moment, and the whispers ceased. All that remained was the eerie silence, pressing in on them like a weight. Then, suddenly they heard it, a soft crack of a twig, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving in the brush. But it wasn't just the sound of footsteps. It was something else, something unnatural. The sound was too deliberate, too measured, like someone was stepping carefully, making sure they were heard. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. Ben's eyes darted nervously around them. "Did you hear that?" Before anyone could respond, a shadow flickered at the edge of their flashlight's reach. Something moved, but it wasn't human. It was fast, too fast, and when it shifted, it almost seemed to blend with the trees themselves. A dark figure, too quick for their eyes to catch, but they all saw it. They all felt it. Something was out there, watching them from the darkness, waiting for the moment to strike. Ben took a step back. Okay, maybe we should head back now, but it was already too late. The forest had them. They were no longer just lost in the woods. They were trapped. The unseen watchers had begun to close in, and they were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. The whispers were getting louder, more urgent, and with each passing second, the feeling of being watched grew more intense. The shadows seemed to stretch toward them, reaching with long, bony fingers, eager to drag them into the darkness. A question now wasn't whether or not they would make it out of Black Hollow. The question was, if they did, would they ever be the same again? Sarah was the first to hear it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very earth beneath them. It wasn't the sound of an animal, nor was it the wind. It was deeper, darker, more unsettling, as if it was something alive, something ancient. The sound crawled up her spine, sending a chill through her body. Her feet froze, rooted to the spot, as her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted nervously around the dark forest, but there was nothing, except the oppressive silence and the strange tension in the air. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She wasn't sure if she wanted an answer. The words had barely left her mouth when she realized that the others had also stopped, their faces pale, their eyes wide in fear. They too had heard it. The forest around them seemed to shift as though it were alive, its presence growing stronger with each passing second. It was as though the trees were watching them, listening to their every move. The leaves rustled, but this time, it wasn't the gentle sound of wind passing through branches. This was different. It was deliberate. Something was moving through the woods, just beyond the reach of their flashlights. The darkness seemed to deepen, swallowing the light and making the shadows grow longer, more threatening. A soft rustling reached their ears, followed by the unmistakable snap of a branch breaking under the weight of something heavy. The sound echoed through the woods, sharp and jarring, sending a ripple of panic through the group. Ben was the first to move, stepping cautiously forward, his flashlight swinging wildly in the direction of the noise. But the beam of light seemed to struggle against the oppressive darkness, barely making a dent in the thick shadows that surrounded them. "Just an animal," Ben muttered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He didn't believe it himself. They all knew that no animal moved with such intent, such purpose, and yet they all remained silent, waiting for something to happen, something to give them a sign that this was just a trick of the mind. But before anyone could react further, it happened. A sharp scream split the air. It wasn't a scream of surprise or of fear alone. It was pure terror. It was the kind of scream that only comes from the deepest part of the soul when faced with something so terrifying that it bypasses the mind's ability to comprehend it. The scream echoed through the woods. bouncing off the trees, reverberating in their chests, making the very ground beneath their feet feel unstable. It was Emily. Her face was a mask of fear, her eyes wide and unfocused, staring into the darkness as she turned toward the group, pointing a trembling finger towards something they could not yet see. It's moving, she gasped, her words barely coming out through her panting breaths. Jake, who had been walking just a few steps behind Emily, turned quickly, his heart racing in his chest. He followed her gaze, his flashlight flickering as it landed on a patch of blackness in the distance. For a moment, there was nothing, just the oppressive darkness of the forest stretching endlessly in front of them. But then, it shifted. It moved. Someone was out there, emerging from the shadows, slowly, like a figure moving just beyond the range of their perception, but moving in a way that wasn't quite human. Jake's flashlight caught something. At first, it was just a glimpse, a flash of dark movement in the corner of his eye. But then, it grew clearer. It was a figure, tall and thin, its shape twisted, as though it didn't quite fit within the natural form of the human body. The figure seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a shadow struggling to hold its shape. The air around them seemed to grow thicker, the temperature dropping further, as if the presence in the woods was stealing the warmth from the air. Is that a person? Sarah's voice trembled, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. No way, Ben replied, his voice strained. He stepped back, his eyes fixed on the shape in the distance. That's not a person. The figure didn't make a sound. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, nothing to suggest that it was even walking. It just moved, its body undulating and shifting with each moment, like it was both part of the forest and something completely foreign to it. It moved closer, but it didn't get any clearer. The more they tried to focus on it, the more it seemed to blur, as though the darkness itself was trying to keep it hidden from their eyes. Emily's eyes were wide with terror, her hand still outstretched toward the moving figure. "It's coming closer," she whispered, barely able to breathe as the words escaped her lips. Without thinking, Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her back, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to go, now." But as he tugged her toward him, the figure moved again, faster this time, its shape twisting in a way that didn't seem physically possible. It was no longer just standing in the distance, lingering in the shadows. Panic spread like wildfire. Ben grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her in the opposite direction as Jake yanked Emily to her feet. "Run!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. They turned, their feet pounding the forest floor as they began to flee back toward the way they came. But the moment they started to move, The figure did too. It followed them, its movements erratic and unnatural. Sliding between the trees, its form flickering in and out of existence like a bad dream. The forest that had once seemed like a place of beauty now felt like a prison. The trees no longer looked welcoming. They looked like walls, closing in, pushing them back toward whatever it was that was following them. The whispers, which had been soft at first, now filled the air, growing louder, more insistent. It was as if the forest itself was alive, speaking to them, urging them to turn around, to face whatever was in the darkness. And then it came, another scream, louder this time. It wasn't Emily. It wasn't one of them. It was something else. Something that seemed to echo through the very trees, as if the woods themselves were alive with sound. The air thickened, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, making it harder to move. The shadows stretched longer, closing in on them with every step. Suddenly, the whispers became words. Words they couldn't understand, but they felt them deep in their bones. Words that seemed to crawl into their minds, planting seeds of doubt, fear, and confusion. Turn back, it's too late, you cannot escape. Jake's heart pounded as he looked over his shoulder. The figure was closer now, moving too quickly to be human, too smoothly to be real. It was closing in on them, its form becoming clearer with each passing second. He could feel its eyes on them, though he hadn't seen its face. He didn't need to. The woods were no longer just a place they had entered. They were now a nightmare they could not wake up from. "Keep running!" Ben yelled, his voice panicked. "Don't stop!" But even as they ran, they all knew deep down that it didn't matter. They weren't running from the figure. They were running from something much worse. The realization that Black Hollow was alive, and it was hungry. Jake's heart raced as he turned to look, his eyes narrowing as they tried to pierce the thick, oppressive darkness around them. There, in the distance, just beyond the reach of their flashlight, stood a figure. At first, it was little more than a silhouette, a dark shape against the blackness of the forest. But as Jake's pulse quickened and his breath became shallow, he saw it more clearly. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall and thin, its limbs stretching at odd angles, as though it were built of something other than flesh and bone. It stood there, shrouded in shadow, its body twisting and contorting in ways that defied logic. Every movement it made seemed wrong, like it was a marionette with strings pulled in directions it was never meant to move. The sight made Jake's stomach churn, his skin crawling as if the air itself had become thick with malice. "What the hell is that?" Ben shouted, his voice a mix of terror and disbelief. He took a step back, his feet stumbling over the uneven forest floor, his eyes never leaving the figure in the distance. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second, the shadow seemed to disappear, as though the figure were a trick of the light. But when the light steadied again, it was still there, standing motionless in the darkness. The figure didn't respond. It didn't make a sound, not even the faintest whisper to indicate it was aware of them. It just stood there, frozen in place, watching them. Its shape flickered in the shadows, and for a moment, it almost seemed to blend with the darkness itself, as if it was part of the very forest. But then, the air around them thickened, the weight of the presence pressing down on their chests. It was as if the very woods had become aware of their intrusion. The trees seemed to close in around them, their limbs reaching out as if trying to ensnare them, to keep them trapped in the gaze of this figure that had no right to be in the world of the living. Ben's breathing grew more frantic as he stumbled backward. His flashlight swung wildly, casting erratic beams of light across the trees. But it was useless. The figure remained just out of reach, an enigma, both present and yet absent, like it existed outside the realm of their understanding. Ben opened his mouth to shout again, but his voice caught in his throat, strangled by the fear that gripped him. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, the primal instinct screaming at him to run, to get as far away from whatever this thing was. But his legs wouldn't move, frozen in place by a terror that felt deeper than anything he had ever known. Emily, who had been standing beside Sarah, now stepped forward, her voice trembling with the same fear that seemed to grip everyone. "It's not human," she said, her words faltering. "It can't be. What the hell is that thing?" Sarah's eyes were wide with terror, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't find the words to describe what they were seeing. She was paralyzed, her feet planted firmly on the forest floor, unable to tear her gaze away from the figure that seemed to pull the very light from the air. It was as though the forest had turned against them, wrapping them in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Jake's mind raced, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. His logical mind fought against the fear that clawed at the edges of his thoughts. There had to be a rational explanation. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, some kind of optical illusion. But deep down, Jake knew better. He had seen enough to realize that this was no hallucination. This was something real, something dark and ancient, and it was watching them. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its shape shifting slightly as if it were adjusting itself, its limbs contorting in unnatural ways, stretching and twisting like rubber. Its head was tilted slightly to one side, and though Jake couldn't make out any facial features, he could feel its eyes on them, boring into them, seeing them in a way that made him feel naked, exposed. The trees around them creaked, as if groaning under the weight of the silence, and Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if it was pushing down on him, forcing him to acknowledge the presence of this thing that didn't belong. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. One moment, it was there, standing just beyond the reach of their flashlights, and the next, it was gone. There was no sound, no movement, no indication that it had ever been there at all. The forest around them seemed to breathe a collective sigh, as if the tension that had been building in the air had suddenly released. The shadows no longer felt so heavy, and the oppressive silence was momentarily broken by the wind rustling the leaves overhead. But the relief didn't last. They all stood there, staring at the spot where the figure had been, their breaths shallow and quick, their hearts racing. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what they would do next. Did anyone else see that? Ben's voice cracked as he finally spoke, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked around at the others, searching for some sign that what they had seen had been a shared experience, something they could rationalize, something that could explain away the terror they had just witnessed. But none of them spoke. They didn't need to. They all knew. They had all seen it. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What the hell was that thing?" she whispered, her voice shaking. It wasn't human. It was something else. Jake didn't answer right away. He couldn't. He was still trying to process what had just happened, still trying to make sense of the image that was burned into his mind. The figure, tall, thin, and completely wrong, had moved with such speed, such unnatural grace, that it was as though it had no business existing in the physical world. It had been a shadow, and yet it wasn't. It was more than that. It was something dark, something hungry, something ancient. And now it was gone, as though it had never been there at all. But Jake knew that wasn't true. He knew that it had been real, and that terrified him more than anything. The forest around them was quiet now, too quiet. The tension that had been building for the past hour seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. The whispers, which had been a constant undercurrent to their every movement, had fallen silent. But even in the silence, they could feel it. Something was still out there, watching, waiting. "I think we need to leave," Sarah said, her voice low but urgent. Now. Ben didn't need any more convincing. Without another word, he turned and started walking back the way they had come, his steps quick and uneven, as if the ground beneath him was unstable. Jake, Emily, and Sarah followed, their flashlights scanning the darkness ahead, but it was hard to focus. The trees seemed to close in around them, the shadows too thick, the darkness too heavy. As they moved, the sense of being watched never left them. It was as if the very forest itself had become their enemy, its ancient presence pressing down on them, forcing them to acknowledge that they didn't belong. Panic set in as the group realized they were not alone. It wasn't just the figure they had seen earlier, it was something far worse. The entire forest, it seemed, was alive with something ancient, something that had been watching them from the moment they stepped into Black Hollow. The whispers, which had been faint and distant before, now felt like 1,000 voices, murmuring in the back of their minds, clawing at their sanity. Each whisper was a thread, weaving its way into their thoughts, twisting and distorting them. It was as though the forest was speaking to them, but the words didn't make sense. They couldn't understand the language, but they felt it, a deep, unsettling sense of being surrounded, of being trapped in a place where they didn't belong. The trees around them seemed to grow taller, their trunks thicker, their roots digging deeper into the earth, pulling the very ground beneath their feet tighter, as if trying to keep them from escaping. The air was thick with moisture, and the fog that had settled in the hollow earlier was now creeping back, swirling around their ankles, adding to the suffocating atmosphere. The further they tried to move, the more the path seemed to twist and shift, as if the woods themselves were changing, their once familiar landmarks disappearing, swallowed by the ever-expanding darkness. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled forward, her flashlight flickering in the thick fog. She could feel the cold seep into her bones, and her legs felt like lead, as if the very air was pressing her down. She looked over at Jake, who was just ahead of her, his face pale and drawn, his flashlight moving in erratic circles. His steps were hurried, almost frantic, as though he was trying to find some kind of exit that didn't seem to exist. Ben and Emily were further behind, their voices barely audible as they called out to each other, but the fog and the darkness swallowed their words. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaky, barely a whisper against the overwhelming silence that had descended upon them. She didn't know what was worse, the terrifying things they had seen, or the fact that now, more than ever, she felt as though they were being hunted, as if the forest itself had turned against them. Now, we need to get out. Jake didn't respond at first, his eyes scanning the trees around them, his breathing ragged as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The path they had taken was no longer where it had been. They had walked deeper into the hollow, but now the very path they had used to enter seemed to have disappeared. The trees loomed in every direction, their shadows stretching across the ground, making the entire forest feel like a maze that had no end. The familiar landmarks, the spots they had passed just moments ago, had vanished, replaced by more twisted, gnarled trees that seemed to close in on them, trapping them in a nightmare that no one had been prepared for. A feeling of being watched intensified. Every rustle in the leaves, every whisper of the wind made them flinch. They were no longer alone. There were things in the forest, things that moved in the shadows, things that watched from the darkness between the trees. It was as though the forest was alive, with a consciousness of its own, aware of their every movement, and it didn't want them to leave. The whispering voices seemed to grow louder with every passing moment, the words coming faster now, like a chant, repeating in their minds. Sarah could hear them clearly now. Stay, stay. It wasn't just the forest. It was the very air around them, heavy with an ancient power that refused to let them go. They turned back, hoping to retrace their steps, to find the path they had come from, but it was no use. The trees had shifted. The familiar markers were gone. The way back had been erased. It was as if the woods had swallowed the path whole, consuming everything they had known. The more they searched for an exit, the deeper they sank into the nightmare. Each step felt like it was taking them further away from any hope of escape, and with every turn, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. The trees creaked and groaned as if they were alive, their limbs bending and twisting unnaturally, reaching for them, pushing them further into the heart of the hollow. Emily's voice was the first to break through the terror. "We need to stick together," she said, her tone more controlled than Sarah had expected. "Don't split up. Keep moving. We have to find a way out." Ben, who had been silent for too long, nodded, though his eyes betrayed the fear that was starting to take over. "We'll find a way out," he said, but his voice was hollow, lacking the usual confidence he carried with him. His flashlight wavered in his hand, casting erratic beams of light that barely cut through the suffocating fog. He scanned the trees around them, but there was nothing except more trees, stretching endlessly into the dark. Sarah's eyes darted nervously from one side to the other. The voices, the whispers, they were getting louder now, all around them, like a swarm of insects in the back of her mind, buzzing and chanting, pushing her closer to the edge. She couldn't understand the words, but the feeling of dread in her chest grew stronger, deeper. It was as if the forest itself was trying to invade her thoughts, trying to break her down from the inside out. And then, just as she was about to say something, a loud crack echoed through the air, a sharp snap of a branch, followed by a rush of movement. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat as her flashlight swung wildly, cutting through the thick fog. The beam of light landed on something, someone in the distance. It was just a shadow at first, barely perceptible, but as the light steadied, it became clearer. A figure, tall, thin, and moving in a way that was far too fast, far too unnatural to be human. It darted between the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. But its presence lingered, its eerie sense of malice hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Ben was the first to react, his flashlight falling to the ground as he stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror. "It's back!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "It's watching us!" Jake turned, his breath quickening, his pulse hammering in his ears. "What was that?" he yelled, his voice full of panic. But the figure, whatever it had been, was already gone. The forest was silent once again, save for the frantic beating of their hearts and the whispers in the air. Sarah didn't know what to think anymore. The figure, whatever it was, wasn't human. She had seen it clearly, moving with impossible speed, its limbs bending in ways that made her stomach churn. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something dark, something wrong, something that didn't belong in this world. It was watching them, hunting them, and they had no idea how to escape. The woods around them felt smaller now, more suffocating. The trees seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, more oppressive. They weren't just lost in the woods. They were being corralled, trapped in a nightmare that they couldn't wake up from. The more they tried to move, the more the trees seemed to push them back, the whispers growing louder in their minds, urging them to stay, to never leave. "We can't stay here," Emily said, her voice trembling but determined. "We have to keep moving. We can't let whatever that is catch us." But even as she spoke, the words felt hollow. The forest was alive with something that didn't want them to leave. The path, the way out, it was gone. And they were deeper in the nightmare than they could ever have imagined. The trees were not just trees. They were part of something far older, far more powerful. They were part of Black Hollow, and Black Hollow was never going to let them go. As they stumbled through the darkness, their feet dragging through the thick underbrush and leaves, the air pressing down on them like a physical weight, they suddenly came across something unexpected. It was hidden among the foliage, half buried in the damp earth, its stone surface darkened by years of neglect. At first, it seemed like just another forgotten relic of the forest, a part of the landscape that had been lost to time. But as they drew closer, something about it caught their attention. The stone was old, too old, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to tell a story. The details were worn away by centuries of exposure, but they could still make out the faint outlines of symbols, some recognizable, others alien and unsettling. Jake was the first to kneel down, his fingers brushing the surface of the stone as he tried to clear away the dirt and leaves that had accumulated over it. The stone felt cold to the touch, and even in the darkness, there was something strange about the way it absorbed the light from their flashlights. It almost seemed to swallow the light, making the area around it feel darker, colder. "What is this?" Jake asked, his voice filled with a mixture of curiosity and unease. He ran his fingers over the worn symbols, tracing the shapes of the carvings, his breath catching in his throat as a sense of dread began to settle over him. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he continued to examine the stone, the sensation of being watched growing stronger with each passing second. Ben, who had been quiet up until now, stepped forward cautiously. His eyes, usually full of confidence, were now shadowed with worry. He knew more about the history of the area than any of them, and it was clear from the way he studied the stone that he recognized what it was. His voice, when he spoke, was low and measured, as though he were afraid that even the slightest wrong word could awaken something far worse than they had already encountered. This is the marker of the curse," Ben said, his voice hushed, barely above a whisper. "This is what we've been walking toward this whole time. Black Hollow wasn't always like this. It wasn't always the twisted, dark place that we've come to know. It used to be a sacred place, a place of power." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sarah, who had been silent until now, looked up at Ben, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Sacred, a place of power. What are you talking about? I don't understand." Ben hesitated, his gaze lingering on the stone, as if it held the answers to questions he had spent years trying to avoid. Before the curse was placed, this forest was revered. The land here was sacred to the indigenous people, a place where they believed the spirits of the earth resided. It was a site of rituals, of communion with the natural forces that governed the world. But then, something happened. He paused, glancing around the dark forest, his voice faltering for a moment. The curse, it twisted everything. What was once a place of power became a place of darkness. The land, it changed, and those who enter, those who disturb the hollow, they are never the same. Emily stepped closer to the stone, her flashlight flickering in the air. "What do you mean, never the same?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion and fear. "What does the curse do?" Ben's eyes flickered with a shadow of fear as he looked at Emily. "The curse changes you. It feeds on fear, your fear. And once you hear the whispers, once you hear them in your mind, there's no escaping it. It gets inside you, takes root, and slowly, you become a part of the forest, a part of whatever is waiting out there in the dark. Sarah took a step back, her mind racing as she tried to process what Ben was saying. The stories, the whispers, the eerie presence that had been following them, it was all tied to this curse, to the land they were standing on. The forest wasn't just a place they had wandered into by accident. It was a place that had been waiting for them, pulling them in, feeding off their fear. "You're saying that we're being changed?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "That whatever this is, it's happening to us? That we're not going to leave this place the same?" Ben nodded, his face pale, his expression grim. "Yes. Once the curse takes hold, it doesn't let go. You may leave physically, but the hollow, it never leaves you. You'll carry it with you. You'll hear the whispers in your mind, see things in the dark, and feel the pull to come back. It twists your thoughts, your memories. It makes you question what's real and what's not. And eventually, you'll return to the forest, whether you want to or not." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine as she looked at the stone again, her mind reeling. It all made sense now. The strange feeling they had had since entering the hollow. The sense of being watched, of something constantly just beyond their reach. The whispers, they weren't just in the wind. They were real. They were part of the curse, part of the power that had been unleashed when they had set foot in this forsaken place. "But how do we stop it?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do we get out of here without becoming part of it?" Ben shook his head slowly, his eyes dark with the weight of the knowledge he carried. "You can't just leave, not completely, not without the hollow taking something from you. It takes pieces of you, slowly, over time. And if you're not careful, it takes everything." Jake felt a wave of nausea hit him as he stepped away from the stone, his mind racing. The forest around them had grown eerily still, the oppressive silence pressing in on them from all sides. He could feel the weight of the curse like a physical presence, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. Every part of him screamed to get out, to run, but deep down, he knew there was nowhere to run. The forest had already claimed them. "So, we're trapped?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse with fear and disbelief. "There's no way out?" Ben didn't answer immediately. He just looked down at the stone, his face a mask of sorrow and regret. "Maybe there is a way out, but it's not going to be easy. We would need to break the curse. We would need to find a way to appease the spirits of the land, to undo what was done. But that's not something any of us are prepared for. And time is running out. The longer we stay, the harder it will be to escape." Emily looked at the others, her eyes wide with panic. "Then what do we do? We can't just stay here. We can't just give up." Ben took a deep breath, his gaze steadying as he looked around at the group. "We need to find the source of the curse. We need to get to the heart of Black Hollow. But we have to be careful. We're not just fighting the forest now. We're fighting whatever is in the dark with us." Jake's stomach turned as the realization set in. They weren't just lost in the woods. They were lost in a nightmare. a nightmare that wasn't going to let them wake up. And the longer they stayed, the more they became part of it. They had already heard the whispers. They had already felt the pull. And now, it was only a matter of time before Black Hollow would claim them completely. The realization hit them all at once, crashing over them like a tidal wave. The curse wasn't just a tale passed down from generation to generation. It wasn't a story made to frighten children or scare the townspeople into staying away from the forest. It was real. The moment they had set foot in Black Hollow, they had sealed their fate. The curse had already begun to take hold of them, twisting the very land they stood on, weaving its dark grip around their minds and bodies. It wasn't a matter of if they would escape. It was a matter of when they would succumb to the darkness. And now they were trapped. The walls of the forest had closed in around them, and there was no way out. Panic began to spread among the group, their breaths coming faster as the weight of their situation became undeniable. They had been running on adrenaline, desperately trying to find a way out. But now, with the full force of the curse pressing down on them, they could no longer ignore the truth. The forest wasn't just an obstacle. It was alive. A conscious entity that was hell-bent on keeping them there, on claiming them as part of its twisted, eternal existence. The trees, once standing tall and still, now groaned and creaked as if they were alive, their bark shifting and contorting in unnatural ways. The branches twisted, not with the gentle sway of the wind, but with purpose, twisting, bending, reaching toward them like long, gnarled fingers trying to ensnare them. The ground beneath their feet trembled, sending vibrations up through their legs. It was subtle at first, a slight shudder, but then it grew stronger, more insistent, as if the earth itself were alive and reacting to their presence. The forest was awakening, and it was angry. They could feel it. The land itself was reacting to them, as if it knew they didn't belong there, as if it had been waiting for them, for their arrival, and now it was preparing to claim them. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. What had once been a faint murmur just on the edge of hearing was now a chorus of voices echoing through the trees and the fog. The voices weren't just sounds in the wind. They were calling to them, beckoning them, urging them to listen, to give in. The words were unintelligible, but there was a tone to them, a malice that seeped into their very souls. The voices felt like they were coming from every direction, surrounding them, pushing in on them from all sides. It was as though the forest itself was speaking to them, pulling at their sanity, trying to break them down. They were no longer just hearing the wind in the trees. They were hearing the forest's hunger, its desire to consume them. "There's no way out," Sarah cried, her voice raw with terror. Her hands were shaking as she clutched her flashlight, her face pale and wide-eyed. The words spilled from her lips like an inevitable truth. She had known, deep down, that they weren't just lost. They were trapped, and the forest wasn't going to let them leave. "We're never leaving here." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. She looked at each of them, her eyes searching their faces for some sign of hope, but there was none. They had seen too much, felt too much. The forest was alive, and they were its prey. There was no escape from this place. They had come too far, and now it was too late. Jake turned to face the others, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. His usual bravado had long since drained from him. The terror was evident in every line of his face. He swallowed hard, trying to maintain some semblance of control. But even he knew the truth now. There was no way out of Black Hollow. "We need to stay together. Stay close," he said, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. He didn't know what else to say. What could he say? The darkness was closing in on them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But even as he spoke, the ground beneath them trembled once more, the vibrations traveling through the earth and into their bones. The trees around them groaned louder now, their limbs cracking and snapping like the bones of some great, unseen beast. The whispers were no longer just in the air. They were inside their heads. The voices were growing louder, clearer, as if they were speaking directly to them. The very forest seemed to be feeding on their fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. The oppressive darkness seemed to press down on them, thick and suffocating, as if it were alive, breathing, waiting. The trees that had once been distant, silent witnesses to their presence, were now closing in, surrounding them, blocking out any hope of escape. The flashlight beams cut through the fog, but it was like trying to carve through thick black velvet. Useless. The more they moved, the tighter the forest seemed to close round them, as though the woods themselves were swallowing them whole. Emily's eyes darted nervously around, her flashlight shaking in her hand. She was hyperventilating, struggling to breathe through the panic that was clawing at her chest. "We need to find a way out. We can't just stand here," she said, her voice rising with panic. Her words, however, were swallowed by the silence that followed. They had tried to find a way out, but the forest had already rejected them. The path was gone, and the trees stood like an impenetrable wall. N's face was grim as he turned toward the others, his expression hollow. "We're not getting out," he said, his voice flat, resigned. "Not unless we break the curse." His eyes swept over the group, as though he were searching for some shred of hope, some way to fight back. But even he knew that hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. The curse was real, and it had already claimed them. "Break the curse?" Sarah repeated, her voice cracking with disbelief. "How? How do we break it? We've been in here for hours, and it feels like it's getting worse. We're losing time. We're losing ourselves." Ben looked away, his jaw tightening. "I don't know how. No one knows, but we have to find the heart of Black Hollow. We have to get to the source of the curse." He paused, swallowing hard, his eyes scanning the trees, as if they were about to reach out and grab him. "But I don't think we have much time left." The wind picked up again, whistling through the trees, and for a moment it felt as if the very earth was responding to their fear. The ground beneath them trembled once more, and the air grew thick with an oppressive pressure, as though the forest itself was growing restless, waiting for something to happen. The whispers, now louder than ever, filled their heads, each one vying for attention, a cacophony of voices that refused to be ignored. The darkness pressed in on them, and in that moment, they realized just how deep they had fallen into the heart of the curse. The trees were no longer just trees. They were a part of the curse itself, living and breathing with a mind of their own. And they, the intruders, were nothing more than prey. The realization was too much to bear, and as they stood there, huddled together, they understood that they had crossed a point of no return. The curse wasn't something they could outrun, something they could leave behind. It had already taken root inside them, feeding on their fear, their doubt, their desperation. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice trembling now, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. "We need to face it. We need to find whatever's at the center of this and end it." But even as he spoke, the forest seemed to shift again. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. It was too late. They were no longer just lost in the woods. They were part of it. Black Hollow had claimed them, and now it was watching, waiting for the final moment when it would consume them completely. As the clock struck 1, the air turned thick with fear. It wasn't the kind of fear that clutched at your chest and made you want to scream. No, this was the kind of fear that wrapped itself around your soul, slowly squeezing, tightening until you could hardly breathe. Every step they took felt heavier, as if the ground itself was resisting them, pulling them down, making it harder to move forward. It was as though the earth beneath their feet was alive, and it didn't want them to leave. The trees around them, which had been twisting and groaning, now stood eerily still. There was no movement, no sound, no indication of life, But the stillness was far more unsettling than the noise had been. It was the kind of silence that could only come from something unnatural, something that had been waiting, watching for a long time. The group now spread out across the dark, fog-laden forest couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. They couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but they could feel it. The presence of something behind them, something that was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't even a shadow. It was a presence, an oppressive weight in the air, as if the forest itself was alive and observing them. They couldn't explain it, but they all felt it. The prickling on the back of their necks, the hairs standing up on their arms, the sense that something was just out of sight, lurking in the darkness.
Jake, who had been walking ahead, stopped suddenly, his breath shallow and quick. He turned around, his flashlight sweeping across the others. But the beam of light barely made a dent in the overwhelming darkness. "Do you feel that?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the silence that had settled over them. "We're not alone." Sarah, her eyes wide and darting around the trees, nodded slowly. "Yeah, I feel it too. It's like the forest is watching us." Ben, his face pale and drawn, clenched his fists at his sides. He had been trying to keep it together, to remain strong for the others. But the fear was taking its toll. He had seen enough, felt enough, to know that the curse wasn't just a story. It wasn't just the strange happenings they had witnessed. It was real, and it had a power that none of them could comprehend. They had come too far, and now there was no going back. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice shaky, despite his attempts to sound firm. "We need to get to the center, find the heart of this place. We can't waste any more time." But even as he spoke, it felt as though the forest itself was pushing back. Every step they took, every movement they made was met with resistance. It wasn't just the fear or the oppressive atmosphere. It was the sense that the land itself was rejecting them, closing in on them, swallowing them whole. The trees seemed to grow taller, their limbs stretching out, blocking the path ahead, creating a maze that no one could navigate. And yet, there was no wind, no rustling of leaves. The forest was silent, almost suffocatingly so. It was as if the very earth was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And just as suddenly as it had all begun, the forest grew still. The whispers stopped, as if someone had turned off a switch. The voices that had been echoing in their minds, the ones that had been growing louder, more insistent, suddenly fell silent. The trees stood silent as well, no longer groaning or twisting, no longer moving with the unnatural force they had displayed before.
The only sound left was the soft, shaky breath of the group as they stood in the middle of the hollow, surrounded by a stillness that seemed more dangerous than any noise they had heard before. But the silence was worse than the noise.
They all stopped in their tracks, their breath coming in ragged gasps. It was as if the world had stopped, as if time itself had frozen, and for the first time since they had entered Black Hollow, they realized just how deeply they were trapped. The silence pressed down on them, heavy and thick, like a blanket suffocating them. They looked at each other, but there were no words. What could they say? What could they possibly say when they knew, deep down, that they were no longer in control? The forest had taken over, and now it had them exactly where it wanted them.
"I don't like this," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive quiet. She looked around, her flashlight trembling in her hand, casting jittery beams of light across the trees. But the light seemed insignificant now. The darkness was too vast, too overwhelming. The forest felt like it stretched on forever. And in that moment, Emily realized that they could never find their way out. The trees, the earth, the very land, they had become a part of the curse. And once you were a part of it, there was no going back. "I know," Jake said, his voice hollow, almost distant. "This is it, isn't it? We're not getting out of here." The weight of those words hung in the air, and for a long moment, none of them spoke. They didn't need to. The truth was there, staring them in the face, as real as the darkness surrounding them. The curse had already claimed them, and no amount of running, no amount of searching for the heart of Black Hollow could change that. The more they fought against it, the deeper they sank into its grasp. And then, just when they thought they couldn't bear the weight of the silence any longer, it came. A sound. It wasn't the whispers. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the sound of the forest coming to life. No, this was different. It was a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, like something stirring beneath the earth itself. It came from everywhere and nowhere, all at once, vibrating through the ground and into their bones. The sound seemed to vibrate through their entire bodies, like a wave of energy crashing over them. It was so deep, so powerful, that it seemed to shake the very air around them. They all froze, their eyes wide, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound was closer now, unmistakable. It wasn't the forest speaking to them. It was something else, something far worse. The growl was followed by a hiss, a sound like something breathing, something ancient, something far older than the forest itself. And then, from the shadows, it emerged. At first, it was just a figure, a shape, a silhouette against the blackness.
But as it drew closer, as it moved through the darkness with terrifying speed, they could make out the details. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. It was something else. Something twisted and wrong. Its form shifting in unnatural ways, like a nightmare made flesh. The creature was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs long and slender. Its body covered in a black, writhing mass that seemed to shift like liquid. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural, sickly yellow light, and its mouth, when it opened, revealed rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The creature's body seemed to distort as it moved, its very form bending and shifting in ways that made their stomachs churn. For a moment, they stood frozen, too terrified to move, too paralyzed to react. They knew without a doubt that this was no figment of their imagination. This was real. And it was coming for them. "Run!" Ben screamed, breaking the spell that had held them in place. But it was too late. The creature lunged forward, its movement too quick for them to react. And in that instant, they realized with terrifying clarity that the forest had already claimed them. They were no longer just lost. They were trapped in the heart of Black Hollow, and there was no way out. When morning finally arrived, it brought with it an eerie silence, a strange calmness that seemed to settle over Black Hollow. The fog had lifted, and the sun's weak rays filtered through the dense trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The world looked almost normal again, as if nothing had happened, as if the horrors of the night before had been nothing but a bad dream. But for the group of friends, Jake, Sarah, Emily, and Ben, there was no escaping the reality that had unfolded in the darkness. They were found by searchers, shaken and broken, their faces pale and their bodies trembling from exhaustion and fear. They were alive, yes, but they weren't the same. They couldn't explain what had happened, only that they had seen things, felt things, things they couldn't unsee. They were taken back to Cedar Bluff, the familiar streets and peaceful homes, offering no comfort. The town, with its quiet rhythm and idyllic charm, now felt foreign to them, like a place they had once known but could no longer belong to. The simple routines of daily life, the chatter of the market, the clink of coffee cups in the town square, the sound of children playing in the distance, felt hollow, as though the life around them was a cruel mimicry of something they had lost in the woods. Their eyes, once bright with curiosity and hope, were now clouded with an unspoken terror. They had gone into Black Hollow seeking answers, seeking adventure, but what they found there had stolen something from them, something they could never get back. They didn't talk much about what had happened in the forest. The words weren't there, not the right ones anyway. The things they had seen, the horrors they had faced, couldn't be conveyed with a simple sentence or a casual recounting. They tried to speak, to explain to the searchers
what they had gone through. But every time they opened their mouths, the words died on their tongues. How could they explain something so unimaginable, so deeply disturbing, that it shattered the very fabric of their understanding? The creatures, the voices, the suffocating presence of Black Hollow itself. It wasn't just a place. It was a force, something older and more powerful than they could comprehend. And now, it was inside them, a part of their very being, following them, haunting them. The town's people spoke in hushed tones about them. They whispered that they had been through something terrible, something that had marked them in ways no one could understand. They were different now, tired, haunted, forever changed, but no one truly knew what had happened to them in the forest. No one could understand the weight of the curse that had been unleashed in Black Hollow, nor could anyone imagine the depths of terror they had been forced to endure. Sarah, who had always been the skeptic, found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. She had dismissed the warnings of the townspeople, the stories they had all grown up hearing. She had told herself that it was all just superstition, just stories designed to keep people from wandering too far. But now, she couldn't deny it any longer. The curse was real, and it had marked them in ways they would never be able to erase. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadows of the trees, the twisted shapes that had moved in the dark, the whispers that had crawled into her mind. It was as though she could still hear them, the voices calling her back to the hollow, pulling her toward the darkness. There was no escaping it. It had become a part of her, a part of all of them. Jake, who had once been so brave, so confident, now found himself unable to shake the feeling that he was still in the woods. His every step felt heavier, as though the ground beneath him was shifting, pulling him towards something he couldn't escape. The nightmares came every night, vivid and haunting, each one more real than the last. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, the echoes of the forest still ringing in his ears. The fear was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. No matter how far he ran, no matter how much time passed, it was never enough. The hollow had claimed him, and it wouldn't let go. Emily, too, was trapped in her mind. She would spend hours staring out of her window, lost in thought, her hands trembling as they clutched the sides of the chair. The images of the creatures, the shadows that had stalked them through the woods, haunted her every waking moment. She had seen things that no one should ever have to see. But worse than the visions, worse than the creatures, was the feeling that they had never truly left the forest. The whispers still followed her, too quiet to hear, but always there, just out of reach, pulling at her mind. She could feel the hollow waiting for her, calling her back, ready to take her once again. It was a feeling
that grew stronger with each passing day. Ben, the one who had known more about the curse than any of them, was perhaps the most broken of all. He had always believed in the old stories, the ancient myths of the forest. He had studied them, researched them, even come to understand them. But nothing had prepared him for what he had encountered in Black Hollow. Nothing could have. The truth was darker than he had ever imagined. And now he carried that knowledge with him, a heavy burden that weighed on his soul. The curse, he knew, wasn't something you could fight. It wasn't something that could be broken. It was a part of the land, a part of the earth itself, and once you were in its grip, there was no escape. The hollow was patient, and it would wait. It would wait for them to return, as it always had, as it always would.
And Cedar Bluff, with its quiet streets and peaceful woods, would never be the same again. The town that had once been a place of comfort and safety had become something else. A place haunted by the knowledge of what lay just beyond its borders. The woods, once a source of beauty and mystery, had become a prison, and the people who lived there would never forget what had happened. The stories they had once told around campfires now held a deeper, more terrifying meaning. The whispers that had once been laughed off were now the chilling soundtrack of a town that had been touched by something darker than anyone had ever imagined. Some say the curse still lingers in Black Hollow, waiting for the next group of curious souls to wander too close. And when the clock strikes midnight, the whispers begin again, calling out to those who would dare to enter, to those who would disturb the ancient power that rests there. The forest is patient, and it never forgets. The curse is not something that can be escaped, not something that can be outrun. It waits, it watches, and when the time comes, it takes. And so the cycle continues. The whispers in the trees grow louder, and the forest waits, always waiting for the next lost soul to wander into its depths, never to return. The curse of Black Hollow is eternal, and it will never be broken. Not now, not ever. It was the